May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Death and fear surround us on this Good Friday. We mark this day, the day of Jesus' death on the cross, during a worldwide pandemic. Perhaps there have been Good Fridays in your experience where it's been hard for you to get in the right frame of mind. I know there have been for me. Perhaps the sun was shining, the weather was beautiful, things were generally going well for me and everyone I love. On those Good Fridays, I'm ready to skip the cross and jump right to Easter. But today, Good Friday feels very real and very close. Going to the grocery store is now a high anxiety outing. We hear the stories coming out of New York City and wonder if or when that level of death and loss is coming to our own community. We know that Detroit is already suffering high levels of death from COVID, especially among the African American community. The news tells us every day about the deaths of famous people, but there are so many that are dying without that recognition, known and grieved only by their friends and family. We miss our regular lives, the ability to gather with the ones we love, and we dearly miss being able to gather together as a church community for worship, to sing and pray together, and to celebrate the Eucharist. We come to this Good Friday, heavy laden with anxiety, grief, fear, and loss. We just heard the story of Jesus' death from the Gospel of John. Jesus is portrayed in John's Gospel as in control, as not being afraid, as being on a divine mission. The stories in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are a contrast. In those, we see Jesus in the garden, afraid, and asking for God to remove this cup from his lips. Matthew, Mark, and Luke give us a more human side of Jesus as he prepares for his coming betrayal and death. Even Jesus felt overwhelmed and wanted to avoid the coming pain, connecting his humanity to our own. This portrayal of Jesus might be easier for us to relate to, but John's telling of the narrative might just be ideal for our current realities. In John's story, Jesus is not afraid, but everybody else is. We start with Caiaphas, the high priest. The Gospels often make the Jewish high priests and the Pharisees the foil to Jesus. And we know that this has led to much anti-Jewishness amongst Christians, leading to suffering, discrimination, and death for Jews through the centuries. So we need to tread carefully with the portrayal of the Jewish leaders. It is easy to view Caiaphas as the enemy in this story, and he is indeed complicit in the death of Jesus. But why would he want Jesus dead? Verse 14 says, Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jews that it was better to have one person die for the people. The Jewish people are living under the oppressive rule of the Roman Empire. Perhaps Caiaphas believes that Jesus is going to lead a rebellion, which will result in a violent crackdown from Rome that will result in large numbers of deaths. This is a reality for the Jews, and this particular gospel was written 20 years after Rome had destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in a violent and brutal crackdown. Perhaps Caiaphas fears for his people while living under an oppressive regime. Pilate is also afraid. We see that he really wants to let Jesus go, and he tries several times to release him instead of crucifying him. But again, Pilate is caught in the web of power and destruction of the empire, and out of fear, he agrees to have Jesus killed, even after declaring him to be innocent. Peter is also afraid. Last night, we heard an eager Peter, who wants Jesus to wash his entire body and promises to stay loyal to Jesus to the end. When Jesus and the disciples enter the garden and they are confronted by the soldiers, Peter pulls out his sword, ready to fight. He cuts off the ear of a servant of the chief priest before Jesus rebukes him, telling him to put his sword away. Was Peter willing to fight to the death for Jesus, but not willing to watch Jesus be crucified? Perhaps Peter was still hoping for Jesus to be the powerful King Messiah who would overturn Rome by force and make everything right. Peter is afraid and ends up denying Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. A few weeks ago when I preached, I invited us to see ourselves in the Exodus story, to see ourselves as the ones who get afraid in the desert, who aren't our best selves when we get hungry, thirsty, uncomfortable, and in a new situation. Can we see ourselves in Caiaphas, Pilate, and Peter as well? Jesus is not afraid. In the garden, Jesus maintains control of the situation and surrenders himself, not because he is afraid, but because he's being obedient to God. After his trials, Jesus carries his own cross to the crucifixion. And the cross in this Gospel of John is not a moment of humiliation, but instead it's an instrument of God's glory. The cross becomes an instrument of restoration, reconciliation, and love. Jesus declares right before death that it is finished. And we know that the world shifted in that moment. God dies on the cross out of love for God's people, for you and for me, an unthinkable sacrifice from the powerful creator of the universe. Jesus dies on the cross and conquers death. Like so many throughout history and now, Jesus dies at the hands of an oppressive empire in a gruesome death. But Jesus is not a victim. Instead, the Good Shepherd dies to defeat death, suffering, pain, and all the evils of our world. It is finished. Tonight, we leave in darkness and continue to live in the world that is still so full of death and suffering. But we do not have to fear. We know that this is not how the story ends, that Sunday is coming, and with faith, we can proclaim that Jesus is Lord. Amen.